Okay, Isaiah 53, 4 to 12. Would anyone like to read that? It's going to sound a bit familiar to most of you.
I will.
Okay, Rachel, thank you.
Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, we shall see his offspring, and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Does this sound familiar to anyone?
It sounds like the crucifixion of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it, through the Christian lens, not a Jewish lens, but through a Christian lens, it has been viewed as a prophecy, kind of a prophetic text that points to Jesus. So it's been quoted in the New Testament books of John 12, 38, Matthew 8, 17, Acts 8, 32 to 35, Matthew 27, 57, and Luke 22, 37. And I believe Paul liked to use, this text I think was very influential on Paul as well. So what do we think of this text? What stands out to you? What makes you question, makes you wonder?
What stands out to me is that Isaiah was prophesying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was prophesying.
And yet, how perfect, how much it lines up with what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 10 bothers me.
Yeah.
Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain.
Right, we'll get into that, yeah. It points to like a divinely mandated offering, sacrifice, doesn't it? It kind of feels like...
It sounds more like punishment to me.
Mm-hmm. Like Jesus was being used as some kind of sacrificial lamb kind of thing, which is often how we talk about him. But we don't have to be okay with that. We can question it. We can struggle with it. So I want to give a little bit of historical setting to this text. This Isaiah 53 was written during the Babylonian exile of the early 6th century BC or BCE. And so part of Isaiah was written in the 8th century BCE during the Assyrian domination, but this was during the Babylonian exile. For those who have studied the Bible at all, we know that the Israelites who lived in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. Jerusalem was overtaken by the Babylonians, and if the people lived at all, they were exiled to Babylon for quite a while. I forget how many years exactly, but a long time. And in exile, this is a text that kind of points to how they made sense of it and attempted to keep faith in God, viewing their exile as both punishment, but punishment with the purpose of leading them back home to their homeland, and with the purpose of healing them. You know, that they were being punished, but it was not going to last forever. And so this is a good example of kind of how they made sense of what was happening to them. And I think it can be helpful to look at it through that lens too. So is this Jesus being talked about? If this text was written in the early 6th century BCE, that's 600 plus years before Christ would walk the earth. Is it Jesus that this prophet Isaiah is speaking of?
Sounds like it.
Sounds like it.
You have to answer the question, what do you mean by he in that first sentence?
Mm-hmm.
Why is he starting this in this manner? Why does it say, surely he?
Mm-hmm.
And if he's talking to people and he's using that pronoun, they must have an image of what he means. And I don't know what that image is. I don't know what Isaiah's image of he is. Is it a person? Is it
Right.
a priest? Is it?
Right.
I don't know. I don't know.
Right.
We think it's Jesus.
But our Jewish
But I don't know
neighbors
what he means.
Yeah. I think it's helpful, however we view it, our Jewish neighbors do not view this text as pointing to Jesus. And it's just good to admit that. I'm not saying that it's wrong for us to see Jesus in this text, but if we are to be, I mean, the whole point of Bible study, right, is to become as educated as we can about the Bible. And this Isaiah was part of the Hebrew Bible, right? Written to a Jewish audience. And it's just helpful to remember that they view this as possibly a coming Messiah, as we do too, but we may just kind of land at a different spot on who that Messiah is. But nonetheless, we have an unnamed man being described in Isaiah 53. And this unnamed man suffers on behalf of Israel. Rick.
Yeah, all the, what we have to remember, and I took a course in seminary on Isaiah, and the professor made a point of saying, we have to remember that all of the things that the prophet said were, there was a fulfillment of that prophecy during the lifetime of that prophet. And we don't think about it that way. We read it, as you said, through the eyes of our Christian faith. And so there really, in a sense, there's two fulfillments. One happened, and we don't know who that unnamed man was, but somebody died. The other part of this is that the roots of what he says go back to the Day of Atonement. That once, as we said, I think last week, once a year, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, probably many of them, for the sins of the people. And what's being the equation here is, from our point of view, Jesus is that sacrificial lamb. And the danger, and maybe you were going to go this way, is that the church has leaned very heavily on the notion that, well, we sinned. Somebody had to die to make God happy again. That's not why God, if in fact this prophecy is about Jesus. Got to remember, and this has been a new revelation for me in the last couple of years. God did what he did out of love. It isn't that somebody, that God was punishing Jesus. God loved the world so much, and the emphasis is on love so much, that Jesus took upon himself our sins, or God laid on them, as the prophet says.
Why did anyone have to die for our sins?
Every year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest went into that inner sanctum of the temple, and the law said he had to make sacrifices for the sins of the people. And then the very specific directions on how they were supposed to do that.
So does this come from, in the Old Testament, sacrificing animals, and that is why then?
Yes.
Yes. Levitical or Deuteronomical law.
Yeah.
Levitical law had specifics about sacrifice to the Lord. Now that's the rub that we always had between the Old Testament and the New Testament, though, isn't it? That we don't follow Levitical law anymore, and we don't believe that God still demands any kind of sacrificial lamb. That ultimately we believe Jesus was the fulfillment of that. But I'll even take it a step further and say that I don't believe that Jesus' death was completely, let me add that word, completely divinely mandated. I'm not one of those people who wants to put the blame on God as if Jesus had to suffer and die because God had ordained that. That is one way of interpreting Christ's life and death. And it can be a valid way to interpret it. But then that also kind of allows the Roman Empire, the Jewish people, leaders of that day, and others, it lets them off the hook for trying an innocent man, beating him, flogging him, mocking him, spitting upon him, making him carry his own cross up to Calvary and killing him, crucifying him. And so I kind of view, well, if we look at verses 7 and 10, let me make a point about that. If we look at 7 and 10, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And then in 10, it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain, when you might make his life an offering for sin. You know, when we hear that language, it almost sounds that this unnamed man is a sin offering, like a scapegoat. And, you know, we have to be careful, I think, about how we view, was Jesus' death divinely ordained, divinely mandated, or was his sin... I think that God used his death, nonetheless, but what I think happened was people, humans, being flawed and evil, crucified Jesus because he was a threat to their religion, their power, their system and order of doing things. They thought when he was being called by other people a coming Messiah, a coming King, that language was a threat to many people, to the Jews, to the Roman Empire, to many people. And as people do, they want to silence a threat. They want to take away something that threatens them. I think Jesus was made to be a scapegoat to kind of squelch that threat. And so, did God use that death to reconcile humanity back to God's self? Yes. I believe that good came out of bad, as Joe, I think you kind of mentioned. I think light came out of dark. I think that life came out of death. That's what we believe. God used it for good, even though we intended it for bad, would be another biblical image. But yeah, it was humanity that crucified God in flesh.
Well, in the book that I'm reading, it talks about Jesus keeping quiet because he felt like he needed to fulfill prophecy. And he also said that his kingdom, his kingship, and his kingdom were not of this world.
Mm-hmm.
But yet the Sanhedrin still felt, or the Sadducees, I forget which it is, still felt that he was such a threat. And they didn't like it that he was claiming to be the Son of God. They thought it was blasphemy, of course.
And if we look at the Gospels, he never really makes that claim for himself.
Not this text, but Isaiah 9 and 11.
9 and 11.
Not this one, not this text, but Isaiah 9 and 11.
Chapter 9 and chapter 11, okay.
So that part is, it didn't say Jesus, but they have a King of Kings, build.
They use that language that kind of points to Jesus.
Oh, not any. That is opposite story. That this is that Jesus have to crucify, but 9 and 11, he will build the kingdom in this earth. Because the King of Kings is here, right?
Well, yeah, he did build a kingdom on earth too. And I believe the kingdom of God is something here and now, and not only in the life to come. I don't know if that's exactly what you're pointing to.
This 53 chapter is Jesus is a sacrifice of
like a sacrificial offering.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but 9 and 11 chapter is opposite. He have to live in this earth. They make a kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So that is I get.
Okay, so he had to live on the earth and build a kingdom.
Yeah.
That's what kind of Isaiah 9 and 11 kind of point you to.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. Thank you. Gordon.
I want to go back to Isaiah. It was written to the people in captivity.
Yes, in exile, in
what
captivity.
does this mean to them?
Ooh,
Let's
okay.
not forget,
Yes.
forget about Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
What does this mean to them in the context of their lives at that time?
Okay.
Why
Yes.
is he writing this suddenly out in the midst of this, and all his songs of how to be a servant? And he's saying about servitude here. Why? What message is he giving them?
So, and this is helpful and this is why context is always helpful. This is called a servant song in the book of Isaiah. Now, if we keep in mind that this was written by Israelites in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, we could see why those Israelites would see or believe that God was afflicting them and putting suffering upon someone, maybe a priest, like you said, upon them on the whole. And it's also easy to see why they would want to find purpose and hope in that suffering, right? Because if you don't have hope, you've got nothing. That was the only thing that was keeping them going, was believing that this suffering could be redemptive and that they might be able to go back to their homeland of Jerusalem someday. They didn't know when that was, but yeah, you have to view it through that lens. Don't you?
Let's say they look at this after they go back, after they're released for some of them to go back to Jerusalem, and they come back and look at this.
Mm-hmm.
This is their sign of hope.
Mm-hmm.
This is their sign of belief in the grace of God, to give them a chance again, in a sense.
Right.
And I think if you look at Isaiah that way here, I think, I like to look at it in the context of what it is to the people, relationship between God and the people at that time.
Mm-hmm.
We can look back and think about it as a prophecy. That's okay, we can do that. But I think it's more reflective for them to understand that there is a trust in God here. There's a hope in God. That from their concerns, their captivity right now, there'll be relief.
Yes. The line that sticks out to me is in verse 5 at the end, and by his bruises we are healed.
Yeah.
Most of us have heard that. They're finding purpose in the pain. They're admitting their own sins and transgressions, but they're owning up to the fact that, okay, we deserve to be in exile, but yet they see the hand of God moving to do something with those mistakes, with those sins, to heal them, to almost punish them that they might be made whole again, return to their homeland, worship and live as God had intended. So that's a good point. Now, let me ask...
Question?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Rick.
The other thing, to go back to, I think somebody asked this, the question about how do we know that it isn't, that God just did this to Jesus? But if you read through the Gospels, Jesus constantly talks about doing the will of my Father. I'm here because I'm doing the will of my Father. And then, if you remember, the night before he was crucified, he prayed in agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, if it is your will, take this cup from me, but nevertheless, I'll do what you want me to do. And so there's an element in Jesus that I think is, if we look at it carefully and objectively, he was part of the process. It wasn't just his Father who said, you're going to do this. Jesus knew what was involved and willingly participated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, willingly participated would be the way to frame it.
And doing the will of his Father got him off the hook in the New Testament, because somebody asked him to do something he wanted to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says, well, I'm just going to say no because I don't have the power.
Right.
God didn't give it to me.
Right.
So he let he pulled his punches a little.
Yeah.
When he told somebody no.
He absolutely did. So I want to ask one final question about this text. I want to get into the heart of how we feel about the idea of Jesus, or an unnamed Israelite man at that time, however we want to view it. How do we feel about God using someone as a sin offering? So I'm asking, how do we feel about the idea that some suffering, some punishment might be divinely mandated on us? Are we okay with this idea that God might punish in order to heal? Or that God might punish at all?
I have to ask the question, what is the impact upon the people once this does occur, regardless of whether we believe God mandated it or not? And we see someone making a sacrifice for others. How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel about the community that you live in? What is that feeling? He says somewhere that the best thing or the greatest thing you do is to give your life for your brother. And here we see that. Is God finding some delight in that? Is it, how How does he have delight in that? Is it because of its impact on the people in the community? Or is it because it's just his will?
Yeah. Margaret?
Could you look at Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 16? See what it says.
I don't have that in front
You
of me.
don't have that? It will tell you, God says, that's one of the law. You cannot kill father for the son of his children, and you cannot kill the children for their father's sin. All the sin should be paid by the sinner himself. That's what he says, clearly. That's a law. And so, I don't think it's really directly Jesus was killed in order to undo the sin of humanity. It's not a direct like that. I think there is a lot of different relationships, different reasons involved in this that we have to consider many things. I don't think it's that direct. And I think you could say, I think he died for our sins. At the same time, it's not it's not direct like that. And also you cannot say it's God's will that he should be killed or it's God's will that he's not killed. But isn't it God's will from the beginning is that he wants to have an incredible world of love and happiness. That's his will. And because people sinned, everything became like a process of restoring and renewing and re-establishing. And it's kind of like something small part of a big thing, and we'll never know until we know the whole thing.
Very well put.
You know what I'm saying? You can't really try to solve all Jesus' mission on one of these texts.
We
You
see.
know what I'm saying?
I think so. And I think too we have, when we talk about someone sacrificing on behalf of someone else, it does seem that like we are okay with that thought when it comes to maybe the military. We honor it. We say things like freedom isn't free. And we applaud the sacrifices made by those who served in the military, as we ought to. But somehow if it's like divinely mandated, I know I feel like I have trouble with that. And it's maybe not that I have trouble with someone laying down their life for another, but maybe I'm not comfortable with God orchestrating it or mandating it.
But didn't he do it in the Old Testament?
God did, yes.
I'm not in favor of war either, but
Mhm.
I gotta be honest, I don't know why we question so much of what God does. I really don't.
Okay.
And if Christ had not done his Father's wishes, or however you want to say it, came to earth and died as the final one and done sacrifice for our sins,
Right.
we would still be slaughtering animals and still be back in the old.
Yeah.
God gave us this opportunity
Mhm.
to believe in his Son and to worship through him, or if you want to talk directly to God. I know there's a question, do you pray to God or do you pray to Jesus? If we believe three in one, what's it matter?
Right.
Now, I have trouble sometimes giving the Holy Spirit that too, but I don't know what we would have done had God not sent his Son and his Son been willing. Where would we be today?
like you
But
said, in a
Wouldn't
sacrificial
be-
system.
yeah.
So let's just appreciate what Jesus did for us.
Exactly.
God gave his only son. What a huge sacrifice.
Mhm.
Let's just try to live the best life we can as
Yeah.
Jesus wants us.
Yeah.
But you know, if you know, we do appreciate it's been 2,000 years ago, and
Mhm.
because of through his sacrifice, we still have a chance to become. We have a hope for future. The Christianity was established, and God's providence of restoration continued. However, if when Jesus came and he was honored and followed and accepted with 100% heart by the chosen people, then we wouldn't have this world like today. We would probably a lot more close to kingdom of heaven, because the Jesus came to build a kingdom, and he would have a longer chance to fulfill, and he probably had to die because there's just no way people would accept him. It was just blocked totally. So he had to offer, okay, there's no way people is gonna accept me. So he offered that voluntarily, probably, for that, his personal sacrifice, God can further the salvation. So we still have the hope for salvation. If Jesus was not killed and accepted, we wouldn't still have to hope. We would probably live in the kingdom.
Mhm.
Wouldn't you think? So, in a sense, it was an alternative, which was unfortunate. If Jewish people fulfilled the mission of their chosen nation and accepted Jesus, you know, it would have been much more now, because we appreciate what Jesus did for us. That's an absolute God's message of love. Because of that, we have this hope. Yet, it does not, you know, it would have been better if they didn't kill him.
Mm.
That's,
I want to say one final word before we go on to Mark. Thank you for that. And the thing I want to say applies maybe to some of you here, but I'm also thinking about we have a couple dozen people who watch online, and I feel I need to say this as we unpack Isaiah 53, that we don't want to say that all pain and suffering have been divinely mandated. Now, suffering can be redemptive. It can. Pain, loss, suffering, it all can be used by God and be very, very redemptive. But however we interpret Isaiah 53, we don't want to imply that all suffering is divinely mandated. And I say this because this could be triggering for people who have survived abuse and trauma in their lives. We don't want to say that all pain and suffering was for the sake of a higher divine good, because that can trivialize someone's abuse, someone's pain, or it could even attempt to blame a victim for their own suffering. And I as a pastor, I have to warn against that, because it also could prevent seeking solutions to injustice and abuse. So I just want to kind of end on that yes, Jesus suffered on behalf of humanity, and that suffering thankfully reconciled humanity to God. But to carry that theme to every situation that we encounter, to someone who has been raped or abused or mistreated or marginalized or excluded or left out in any way, to say, well, maybe that's God's way of maybe God is using that to heal you or to teach you a lesson. That's what I want to warn against, because again, it trivializes the pain and abuse that someone unwillingly endured. And I just, again, to those who may be watching online, and to any of you who have survived any kind of trauma and abuse in your life, that wasn't God punishing you. Now, that doesn't mean that God did not use it to make you who you are, or that good didn't come out of it somehow. But let us not say that God imposed that upon you. So I have to say that as we conclude that study.
I think sometimes, and many, many times, our pain and suffering is a result of choices that we have made in our lives. Especially when it comes to abuse. If you hadn't chosen that person, perhaps that would not have happened.
Perhaps, but sometimes I've seen too many, like, I'm kind of addicted to these, like, FBI files and shows like that. Maybe you all have seen them.
Yeah.
A show that I like in particular, that was on A&E about over a decade ago, is called I Survived. And it's firsthand accounts of people who survived very traumatic events and lived to tell about them. And I've heard countless tales of women, mostly women, who married a man, and they, up front, he was nice. You know, up front, he was a likable gentleman. And a couple months into the marriage, his evil side came out and the abuse began. And so what we never want to do is say, you got yourself into this, or you chose the wrong man, or God may be trying to teach you some humility or something through this abuse. We never, ever want to do that.
I think so many times, though, I was in an abusive relationship.
Okay.
And I ignored warning signs. And I don't know, I think if you spend enough time with that person before you choose to marry them, there will be a sign somewhere.
Not always.
Huh?
Not always.
Well, I don't know always.
How long's the time? A year, 2 years, 10 years, 15 years? How long are you looking for the sign?
Well, this is just good to say that we have different perspectives.
Right.
That sometimes we do see signs, but sometimes there are no
Right.
signs. So again, I just want to say that all pain, all suffering is not divinely mandated. But we are thankful that God uses pain and suffering nonetheless, and has throughout history used pain and suffering to redeem humanity, to make us whole, to heal us. Mark 10, 35 to 45. Paul, would you be willing to read? Thank you.
James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, what do we think of this text today?
What is striking here is something about, are you going to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds very intriguing, because he's not talking about baptism with water, that
Right.
Jesus, it's not, doesn't sound like that.
No, it does
There
not.
must be something real deep he's trying to tell.
He's
What do you
he's using communion, Eucharist, and baptismal language here.
Uh-huh.
The cup, because he says, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" Yeah, so he's using this sacramental language of baptism and the Eucharist to point to something beyond those
Yeah.
specific sacraments. We know that he means death, the
Oh.
cross. So what I think is kind of interesting is James and John seem to be speaking about heaven. Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. It sounds like they have a different idea of what glory means. What do we think they mean by glory? What do we think they mean by that?
I think they mean heaven.
I think they mean heaven.
Lots of extra privileges.
Yes, they mean a secure, content place, don't they? A place of safety, a place of honor.
It's
Now-
satisfaction.
Yes, satisfaction. What do you think Jesus means by glory? How might he define that?
Pleasing the Father.
Pleasing the Father, okay.
Did this happen after Jesus told them that he would die
Yes,
and be resurrected?
I believe it has, yes.
So they're referring to the time of resurrection,
Hmm.
I'm assuming.
I'm assuming too.
Yeah.
By the way they started, they didn't make that clear to Jesus. They said, "We want you to do whatever we ask of you,"
Yeah.
which is way out of line.
Yeah.
Almost to the point of being funny.
It's like they're almost trying to trick him. Like, you said that if we ask, you'll do whatever you want for us. Now we've come with a request.
Little arrogance.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
But I think there's one thing to forget, the humanity of the 12. They're a very simple, common people. But Jesus made them much different. He frequently took the 12 aside and talked to them personally about his life. He took the 12 aside and told them about his death and resurrection. He didn't necessarily tell the whole crowd. He told them. So there is a feeling that they are something special,
Okay.
that they have a special closeness to him.
Hmm.
He has alluded to that. And that's why he asked them, can you drink from my cup?
Hmm.
Can you be baptized? I think we have to remember what happened when Jesus was baptized. God said, what did he say?
This
You are
is
my
my
son in
son.
whom I'm well pleased.
Hmm.
Now, if they're going to take that baptism, God's going to say, you are
Well
my
pleased.
chosen
Yeah.
in whom I'm well pleased?
Mhm.
I think he's replicating that whole idea of belonging to God.
Mhm.
And are they willing to do that? And I think they're arrogant here, but there's a little grounds for their arrogance in the sense of how Jesus had
They've
been
been-
working with them.
they've been
and-
handpicked.
And how he needed them when he left. He needed people like that, I think.
Rachel.
I really think that they had no idea what they were asking, because what Jesus is telling them, that
Yeah.
if you want to do that, you're going to have to go through the cross, all the torture, the crucifixion, and they had no idea,
Right.
nothing whatsoever of what he was saying to them.
So again, I want to ask, how would Jesus define glory then? If they're thinking heaven or resurrection or a place of safety,
Well, of
a
course.
place of honor, how then would Jesus define glory to them? If he was to say, well, you're thinking heaven, but I'm thinking, what would that definition be? What would he say?
I think his glorious moment was Annunciation, when he went up.
And it-
After he came back, and he's risen,
Right.
and he's drawn to heaven.
Right.
I think that's his glory, to be with his Father.
What was their concept of heaven back then?
Yeah. I don't know what their full concept of heaven would have been.
Yeah.
I think in this context, his glory means the cross.
Wow.
I think it means death. Because, to your point, Margaret, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or that I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with this baptism that I'm baptized with? Are you able to handle? You don't know what you're asking. Rachel, you implied that. They had no idea, like you said,
That's right.
what they were asking. And they say we are able, but I still don't think they know.
Because he says in 44, whoever wishes to be first, which would be like sitting at his right side and at his left side, they would have to become a slave of all.
Slave or servant of all.
Well, he uses the word slave, but then he, in the next, in 45, he says, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom. So that's what they didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So-
Is that that's what they would have to do to be on his right and on his left.
I wonder too. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Joe.
Bye,
I
Joe.
wonder too, when we say who gets to sit at his right and his left, if his glory is the cross, does that all of a sudden mean the two thieves sitting, hanging beside of him, and that was not for anyone but God to determine?
I think his glory is in heaven, where he is sitting on his throne, and the light around him is so bright that they don't need any other light. That's his glory. That was his reward for doing all that he did. That's what I think.
It's very well put. I think we see even now within the church, within all of society, a yearning to be the greatest, to have more, to be viewed as the best. I think we fall into that trap of thinking if we have more members and more facility space and more money coming in, that we've somehow achieved success, that we've arrived. But I think this gospel kind of points us to a different reality in the kingdom of God, maybe. What do you all think? And again, it points to the first among you must be slave of all.
You know, after we sin, and God is trying to remedy and save everybody and build the kingdom, so those who have the higher power or great appreciation from God will be those who contributed, to the extent how much they contributed in restoring the kingdom. So like you said, Jesus' death, supreme contributor, supreme builder of the thing. So his power would be God's appreciation. So God will be so happy to see him right next to him. Wouldn't you think so? Whoever sacrificed more, who have the purest heart, just to understand it, they will be the next to Father, and he will have the power and glory. But glory has some power, I think. So everybody can see, recognize. We all want that pride, don't we?
Can I offer one differing thought about James and John? It could be said that they didn't know what they were asking, but what if they were not speaking out of selfish ambition, but out of fear? What if they finally have begun to get what Jesus is saying about having to die in order to rise again? What if they finally kind of got that? They finally have a glimpse of what he's been speaking about and predicting, but maybe out of fear, they simply want the promise of a secure, safe future by his side in heaven. What if it's kind of a more innocent attempt not to have glory, not to have power, but to have security and not fear? The fear that they feel as disciples of what may happen to him, what may happen to them. What if they just want some kind of, what if the uncertainty is too much for them to handle, and like any of us, they just want to believe that they'll be okay, that they'll come out on the other side and that they'll be okay? What if they just want that secure future?
The confirmation that they are guaranteed.
So that's a thought I want to offer to you. Now let me add one more caveat to that. When Jesus says, "You do not know what you were asking," are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Or actually, I'm sorry, then in 39, when Jesus says to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized." Okay, now, that sounds like it could be a threat, doesn't it? Like, well, you asked for it, you're going to get it. Right? Okay, so we can take it that way, but what if? What if it's a promise and not a threat? What if it's a promise that you will not always be driven by fear and a need for security, but what if the promise is, I will empower you, I will abide with you, I will make you a faithful disciple, even against your own fear and flaws and sins and selfishness. I will do what I promised. And then you will face death, but you won't face it with fear. You'll face it with hope. What if it's a promise and not a threat? I think that's an interesting take on it.
I think that verse 43 is sort of along that line. Because I think that sometimes we'd like to think that we'd like to try to do that,
Yeah.
but doing it, we find sort of tough, and along the way we sort of get lost.
I agree with that.
43 and 40, to 45.
Yeah. We think that being great means achieving, getting more, doing more. And Jesus is giving us a humble lesson, giving us a humble lesson in greatness, that it comes not by, success and wealth and power and domination, which is the ways of the world, but through laying down one's life, servanthood, death,
And serving others.
and serving others.
So this thing about the rulers in the world, in the secular world.
Mm-hmm.
But in the kingdom, the rulers, like the presidents or the kings, should actually must have God-like attitude toward his subject, like a true parents. Not, because we always think kings and those political people have power and it always oppressive and abuse and everything. But the greater leaders should have the greatest heart for whoever they are trying to rule over. So it's absolute standard for the leaders of the world. Yeah, wouldn't it be great if our political leaders would have that kind of heart? We wouldn't worry. We would understand what they're trying to do about the vaccines and all that thing. We can really trust. They have the right heart. Then we wouldn't have all this controversy, whether you should get them or, all the rest of it, It really shows what we should do.
Well, and we live in a world that some theologians like Walter Wink have called a domination system, so that this idea that we have tyrants and people who lord it over us, that's Jesus is offering a way of resistance to that system of the world that existed then and exists today, how power is exercised over other people, control of people, people having a hierarchy and a rank, some people having dominance and some being subordinate, winners, losers, insiders, outsiders, honored, shamed. We live in this, what we call it, some people call a domination system, the haves and the have-nots. You can call it anything you want to call it, but we do live in that kind of world, and Jesus is saying that I'm giving you an alternative. And it means to get glory, or to be the greatest, you have to be the least. To find life, you've got to go through death.
You have raised an intriguing perspective on what's going on here by suggesting that maybe the disciples, or James and John in particular, are asking what they ask because they want certainty.
I'm going to assume that maybe they get it.
And as I start to think about that from the perspective of how we grow and develop in our faith, the majority of American people prefer certainty over uncertainty, predictability over unpredictability, and answers rather than more questions. And Jesus keeps coming along and saying, you've heard it said of old, but I say to you. And the parables are filled with questions. The guy comes to Jesus, last week's gospel, the rich young man, what do I have to do to be saved? And Jesus answers him with a question. How do you read the law? Wow, it's an intriguing perspective.
Well, I can't take all the credit. It did come out of a commentary, but I like this thought that maybe they began to really understand what Jesus had been saying. Not fully. I don't think they fully got it. Because that's why he says you do not know what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus says elsewhere, he says to them, you want to find life? You got to lose it. You got to deny yourself. You got to pick up your cross. What in the world does that mean? He just keeps throwing things at us. But he doesn't give us a 10-step program on how to do it.
But maybe we can assume that their motivations weren't to be the best, to
Yeah.
be viewed as the most faithful disciples, number one and number two, but maybe they simply, out of fear of the unknown, wanted a secure future, that they wanted that guarantee. And I think we all want that. When is this damn pandemic going to end? When can we get to normal? When can I want to know that I'm going to pay off my house. I want to know if I'm going to end up in an assisted living home. I want to know what is next. I have this cancer diagnosis. Is it going to work out okay? Will the chemotherapy work? We always want that secure answer. It's human too, and I'm not condemning it. But we know that in life we don't get guarantees and we don't get certainty. Boy, this pandemic has humbled me in that. I'm like, what's next? And I think Jesus is pointing to that unknown. And I think when he says, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. I think it's a promise to say no matter what death, what rough path of faith that we take, we will take it together. I will abide with you. I will empower you to be faithful to the end. And I will be faithful with you to the end. He doesn't say it like that, but I'm viewing his words not as threat, that you're going to die like I am, but as promise that you will endure as I will endure, because God will give us the strength and the faith to do that.
Yeah, we would all like security in everything. And like you said, we'd like to know when this is going to end, and and how is this going to end? How am I going to end? And I think it leads us to believe that, as Jesus tells us, we just have to trust. And it becomes really hard to do.
Yes, it
Trust
does.
and wait.
Yeah. Trust and wait.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to look at how did the lives of James and John proceed after Jesus died and rose in a sense.
Yeah.
How did their lives go? And what effect did this particular incident have on those lives? They trusted in him.
Mm-hmm.
They followed him. They probably did not know what was going to happen
Mm-hmm.
eventually to them. And we know what does happen to them to a degree. So, was that the reward for following? Is to have the same ending in the process of trust and belief in God at the end.
And wait.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the trust of what happens afterward.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that the same world we live in?
Yeah. My hope is that I can be faithful till my dying day.
Yeah.
I don't know what faithful is going to look different day to day. Some days being faithful will include doubt, will include wandering, will include falling off the path. But faith that ultimately I will endure, and God will get me to the end faithfully.
You have to think of other Christians who live in a life totally different than ours. We're very secure. This is the biggest blessing we have is our ability to come here and meet like this. How many Christians don't have that and still follow in that faith? They've met the challenge in a sense, and I agree with you. I think probably to pray that you can meet the challenges that are in front and not lose faith. And I think that's what James and John were hoping for.
Mm-hmm.
Not to lose faith in whatever was ahead. So they wanted to see a shining light promised to them.
Mm-hmm.
And he isn't going to give it to them.
No.
No. And I think, is it any different for us in that sense? In our
It
faith
is.
and our belief.
Right. Well, let's.
Is this the John that was Jesus' favorite, or most beloved, or loved the most, according to Scripture?
I believe it is. I'd have to
And
to
is
look
it
that
the
up.
same John that wrote Revelation?
No, that,
It's not the same John that wrote Revelation and not the same John.
I don't believe that the Gospel of John was written by the disciple of John, just again because of, it, I'd have to verify that, but because of how many decades have passed before.
That's what I
the
was
Gospel of
wondering
John.
because
Yeah.
of the time.
Yeah, yeah. Let's conclude with that. Thank you all for a wonderful
Thank you,
dialogue
Scott.
today.
Thank you.
Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks to those who joined online as well. Have a good week. Enjoy the beautiful weather.
Oh, I